I don't like sanding. It's coarse, rough, and irritating. It gets everywhere. Not like using this. With this, everything is soft and smooth.
Stupid sand gets everywhere.
Welcome back to another episode of Only Mando. I'm Avery, Antihero Comics, and on today's episode, we are going to be going over the refinement process, the prepping process, something that only a Jedi would know how to do because it requires a lot of patience or just someone with too much time on their hands. Unless you're working with foam or cardboard or some other type of material that you don't need to prep and sand like this, you're probably mostly going to be using this process. This is a big rinse and repeat process that's used in a lot of 3D printing molds and models. The repetition of it also heavily depends on what kind of materials you're working with, the quality of your 3D print, whether you made it yourself or whether you got it from someone else. Not all 3D prints are made equal, and what I mean by that is the lines. That's what you're looking for with every 3D print. You're looking for the harsh lines. In a perfect world, you would want the thinnest lines or no lines in your 3D print, but that's not how it works. That would just mean less sanding. But there are certain prints that do have a lot less lines, almost virtually none. And those are going to be like resin builds. I don't have any on me right now. I did order some. I ordered my shoulders resin printed. For right now, we will get talking about the 3D prints, which is what universally is used and what you're probably going to use if you're getting started along with me too. So some of the thicker lines are going to require a little more sanding. That's just how it is. I have two very similar 3D prints in the sense that they're made with like similar looking filament, which is what a 3D printer uses. But you can clearly see the lines if I kind of warp it around a little bit. On that one, a little thicker line, going to be a lot harder to buff out. And then these as well, given to me, these are my thigh pieces given to me by my good friend Sean. And they are going to be a little easier to work with because he had a good 3D print on these. But I've made the most progress on my chest plate, and it was actually a really good print to begin with. You can see the process when you get towards the end of the sanding. It's very smooth, very, very smooth. And I'm still going to smooth it out a little bit more. I'm going to use some higher grit, but you can see the back. So it started off like that, kind of ridgy. Wasn't really that bad to begin with, and then I slowly worked on it, and so I'm pretty close to getting into the painting process of doing all this, and I'm excited for that. So, how do you prep these things? So you use a lot of sandpaper and a lot of patience and time and a little elbow grease, but it doesn't always have to be elbow grease, and I'll get to that. You're gonna start with your sandpaper. Look at that, I have it all fanned out like I'm showing off my heart of cards. You're gonna go from coarse to not coarse, very smooth sandpaper. You wanna start with the low grit, the very gritty, coarse sandpaper. A lot of people start below 100. A lot of people start in like the 80s, 80 to like 120 range just to get started, to get those thick lines out of the way and just crank them out. And then they move on to the next process, which is just kind of slowly moving up in grit. I started with 180 on this chest plate and it worked out really well for me, but I'm probably gonna have to go a little lower on the grit for the other pieces just because they have some thicker lines than the chest plate did. So you start with the coarser grit, start low, move up high, and once you start doing that process more and more, and you get up higher and higher in grit, you're gonna eventually get to the 400s, 600s, and that's when you're gonna start the more fun process, in my opinion. You're gonna start the wet sanding process, which is when you dip it in some water, and then you wet sand it, because you're gonna be putting primer filler in between all the sessions of the sanding. You're gonna wet it up, you're gonna make it work really well into that primer and kind of fill in those gaps. You're gonna like do the circular motion, do all that stuff, and it's a little more fun because it's just easier to work with wet sanding than dry sanding. It's very coarse and rough and irritating, just like young Annie likes. So that's the gist of the sandpaper. In between the sanding sessions, you're gonna be using stuff like primer filler. That's not the right bottle. There we go. Primer filler. I have a thing that literally says filler primer right there. And then I got 2-in-1, filler and sandable, which is technically filler primer. But they're both the same thing, just a little bit, probably have a higher build in the filler primer, the direct one. You're gonna be using that in between the grit sandpaper sessions, and you're essentially gonna sand, spray it down, or dust it off first, spray it down with your filler primer, let it sit, let it dry. It doesn't take too long. The longer you let it dry, the longer it's gonna soak in. And then you move up in grit, rinse, repeat, rinse, and repeat. It takes a long time. It takes a few hours, pretty much per piece, so it's a big process. To make it a little easier on the hand sanding, I forgot to mention this, but you can get a cheap little sander. This was only 20 bucks. This little Bauer sander, little hand sander, and you can get the little grit. It looks like a little shovel, like a shovel pattern. I would use it on the bigger pieces. I would not use it on the smaller pieces because you kind of have to get in there with your hand and kind of... Going back to the filler primer, you're going to want to use the same brand that you're using for all the stuff that you're using. I've heard that mixing brands causes like really paint specky stuff because there are different ingredients, different materials used in the cans. I use Rust-Oleum, trusted brands, Rust-Oleum, Krylon. There's like a Texas Gold or something like that. I forget what it is, but a lot of people, Montana Gold, I think, people use their trusted brand. So whatever brand works for you is going to work for you. And I recommend just kind of sticking to that for your paint, everything like that in between. So right now, the piece that I've made the most progress on is my chest plate. I have started the low grit sanding process, the filler primer. I got all the way up to about 600 grit on this bad boy, and it's actually really smooth already. Everybody keeps saying like, nah, you can keep going. So I got 1,000, 1,200, and 2,000 grit. And I'm going to make this thing smooth as a baby's bottom. But I started at 120 grit for this thing, and I did all hand sanding because I didn't have a sander yet. And I worked my way up, and I got up to about the 600 wet sanding phase, so I was wet sanding it the last I was using on it. The wet sanding really melds with the filler primer very well. I'll probably be working on my thigh pieces later. I'm going to do a little time-lapse video of me doing the process to give an example. Kind of when I get to every piece that I have, when I get to this phase, I'm going to kind of then work on them all at once. That's kind of how I'm going to organize it. You can do however you like. Some other little extras that I like to use are going to be like the duster, just to kind of dust the sand off whenever I am done sanding, and just makes it look like I can see the actual progress that I'm making. You also can get like a face mask. Any little standard face mask will do. I got this thing because I didn't know if I was going to be using Bondo, which I'm going to get into right now. And I didn't use Bondo. I haven't used it yet. A lot of people just do not like using Bondo spot putty is what it actually is. Everybody calls her spot putty Bondo. It's pretty much automotive plastic pieces filler for your car. So it gets in the deep scratches. It fills like pinholes and stuff like that. So it works on these very well, but a lot of people don't like using it because it does the same thing that the filler primer does, probably to a greater extent. That's why people like using it the most. When you sand it, it's very messy. You have to apply it with a glove because it's kind of toxic, but it does do a good job of filling in those thick lines from the jump without the use of paint. The filler primer kind of comes out as, and sandpaper, and it's just like you fill it in right away. It's like molding it with like that clay putty that you used to use when you were a kid. Like I said, it's not that expensive, so just go out and get it, try it out. It's not gonna mess up your armor if you use it, so just try it out. And if you like the filler primer, Bondo, and sandpaper, or any combination of those, it's going to work for you. It's going to work for you. So let's jump over to a quick little time-lapse video of me actually using this process as an example. It's going to be really quick. Kind of show you how the whole process is broken down. Let's go. So you're going to start with your dry sanding at a low grit. So grab your electric sander for the bigger parts, or just use your hands. And then you're going to dust off in between. You can switch off between the hand sander and just using your hands, slowly moving up in grit, starting with about 80 or 120. After your dry sanding is done, you've moved up to about 400 grit or so. You're going to hit it with some filler primer, not too heavy of a coat, and then let it dry for about 10 minutes or more. And then after it's dry, grab your 400 or more grit sandpaper, dunk it in some water, and start wet sanding the primer into the grooves. Wipe off in between and rinse and repeat till you're happy with it. Boom! So that is the process of prepping your 3D printed things before you get to the painting, the weathering, the fun part. Everybody wants to just jump straight into the painting, and you can. Put some craftsmanship into it. It makes you feel better about it at the end of the day. It's not going to look bad. It's not going to look terrible. It's going to you're going to see the lines. And if that doesn't bother you, go for it. Next time, we'll probably be getting into a little more of the painting, weathering, all that good stuff. That process, maybe work on some soft goods. I'll probably have an entire soft goods episode. That about does it for this episode. Fall down into the rabbit hole with me. I am falling deep into this rabbit hole. I became obsessed pretty quickly. You can go as so far as to getting your own 3D printer. I don't know if I'm going to go that far, but we will see. So join me next time on Only Mando, episode 2 in the wrap. I appreciate y'all. Comment down below with any tips and advice if you have them. My name is Avery, Antihero Comics. Out.